Okay, folks, welcome back to Two Guys and the Cloud. Although today we have four guys in the cloud because, Bob, we are joined by a couple of esteemed gentlemen here, one of which is a return guest, Todd Peckitz. And, we've got Al. Al, are we saying Al or Albert Kova?
Albert is fine.
Albert. So welcome, Albert. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, just don't put an O at the end of it, man.
Okay, you got it.
It doesn't sound as good.
No worries. No worries. But yeah, no, we're glad to have you two with us. And Bob, intro words.
Yeah, no, that's great. When's our tea time? We got a good foursome here, and we're ready to tee off, right?
Oh,
so this is a great
what a
scenario.
Goal. I would love to do. We should do a session on the course. That would be fantastic.
That would be
or extremely painful. It depends on the day, I guess. But that's golf.
That's right.
And today we're talking about containerization, which actually, if for those that are listening that were tuning into the last time we had Todd on, we sort of stumbled into this conversation and, had a really good dialogue. And we thought, gosh, maybe this could become a longer dialogue. And Todd, you were kind enough to point us in Albert's direction. And, here we are. But Albert, I guess one of the things that I'm hoping, as we sort of get into this dialogue, you could give us just a sense of how you come to this picture. I found we've done now at least a half a dozen of these sessions. And, every time I ask the question about, a person's background, I'm always fascinated because the pathway into IT seems to be very diverse and, really interesting stories that we've heard. So I guess I'd love for us to just spend a few minutes learning about you and where you came from and what you're doing today and how you kind of tie into the containerization conversation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Elliott. Great to be here with you today. It's interesting. I don't really think about this much really. But as I go back, I started working really as a professional at the age of 13. I was working within, because I'm in Southern California. I grew up in LA, and I worked with this nonprofit video production company. And so I got exposed to a lot of technology within the video industry and the Hollywood industry very early in my life, right? So during that time, they had access to a lot of the technology that a lot of businesses would not, right? Because that industry, with the amount of video cameras and technology around production editing and things like that, they were on the forefront of a lot of that, especially when you start getting into like big data storage. A lot of what they needed, in the late 90s, early 90s was something that you didn't see in the industry until like 10 years later. So I start working there. I'm just basically, a grip boy, basically following the cameraman around, pulling cable. Right, so that's kind of where I started in working with professionals and getting used to working with people who were, much more advanced in their professional careers than I was at that stage, right? And then fast forward a couple of years, I become interested in like veterinary medicine, and I love working with animals and things like that. And then I got my first computer around the age of 16, and it was because my brother went off to college, and when he came home, he would bring his computer. And I was just fascinated by that thing. And this is like 1996.
All right. So I of course I have to ask, what was it? Your first computer?
It was just a 486 PC.
Yeah.
Windows 95. Prior to that, my mom had like a Commodore in the house that I just really didn't understand what it did, and we didn't have any use for it, but she had uses for it.
100% remember the Commodore. Just to say it. Yeah, that's awesome.
And just for context, I was a Trash 80 guy, so I had my little tape drive, my little beautiful gray box that nobody really understood where it was going to go. So I think we're all a bunch of nerds at some level, which is kind of exciting at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine was an Apple II, just to kind of share.
So yeah, me too. Good. Apple IIe right here.
Yeah,
right here.
Good times.
Enjoyed Commander on it.
It's awesome. Sorry, Albert.
No.
You'll find that that's part of this thing too. Is unfortunately some of us are afflicted with ADD, and that takes us into special directions. So just to let you know, warning.
So I become fascinated with this thing. And if you really think about like the definition of like hacking, right? A hacker is somebody who takes something apart and then, can put it back together, right? That's the real definition of a hacker, outside of the, the security exploits and all that other stuff that you see. But if you really think about the word in itself, that's what somebody is. If they just, whether they take a car apart and they can put it back together, it's the same mentality, right? So that's what I started doing with a computer, right? I would just try to figure out, how it worked, right? And then I would go to like thrift shops and stuff, and I'd buy pieces and stuff, and I started building my own stuff, and just I wanted to know more. And then that kind of had a huge impact, because that whole veterinary medicine thing just kind of like went out the window. And the whole idea I just became fascinated with computers and computer science. And so, to your point earlier, like some people have different paths, right? My path was more direct. The moment I knew I had this passion for this type of computing work, right? I was like, I'm going to study computer science. And, my brother, he attended UCR, which is the University of California, Riverside, and in Southern California. And it made sense financially, and they also had a computer science program. And so I ended up out there, and me and my brother, we became roommates, and that was basically it. And then after I got my degree, I just basically went in. This is post now 9/11, right? And so I come out of college, and the industry was not, you kind of had, this was post.com bust and all that, and the job market was kind of strange. So I kind of started. I wanted to go into development, and that's kind of where my focus was with computer science, but I ended up getting into system administration, right? And so I go through that for a couple of years, and then move from different companies, and I end up being an IT manager at some point, and then, I still had this love and passion for development, right? So I end up transitioning out of IT, as you would, and start going into development, actual development. So I kind of went from, the actual system administrator side to basically now doing full-time development. And then from there, I just started making my way through different organizations and, climbing the ladder, as you would, right? From, senior developer to a lead developer to a solution architect, and to an architect and consultant. And, you fast forward now, and now where I'm at now with Insight as a senior architect and in the Azure Professional Services team. And so that's been my journey. So it's been much more straightforward the moment I knew that was happening, right? But along the way, I did keep, a lot of the video production stuff going along, just as side jobs, and to help me get through college. And so I did a lot of that on the weekends. I worked for a video production company that did weddings and other celebrations, bar mitzvahs and things of that nature. And it was just, so every weekend I was at some place doing work at some party. And so it was pretty interesting. Got to see a lot of Southern California's a higher tier, if you would, of society in terms of these very expensive events. But it never took me away from what I really wanted to do. So
yeah.
So I'd like to add just, so Albert works on my team, and Albert happens to be very gifted at problem solving. And I think some of his historical background around being a hacker, being able to take things apart and put it together in a better way, is really a mental approach that he has to things. He looks at things and looks at what it's doing and what you're trying to do and how do you do it better. And that kind of brings us to this great conversation about, really talking about containerization. It's kind of a hot buzz out there, and as a team that supports the overall Azure and Microsoft general infrastructure, we hear a lot of customers ask us about, virtualization, containerization, cloud, DevOps, code as a service, and Albert's definitely one of our leaders in that area, and I think that's part of the topic that we're going to cover today, and hopefully we can provide some, simple benefits and understanding, because I think it's a complicated topic, and you could certainly spend a lot of time reading up on it and trying to study it, but it's relatively simple, even though it's complicated. So
I think that's a great segue, Todd. Thank you. And I think, Albert, the challenge with our conversations tend to be, we ultimately get into a level of depth because there's a certain level of folks that listen and they want to understand that detail, but there's also this kind of high altitude description that is in the beginning, so that if I'm a business person listening to this conversation, I can consume what's going on, what's the value, where does it fit within the whole thing. It sort of starts there. So I guess maybe you could help us start at a high altitude. When we're talking about containerization and the cloud, what is this thing? Where does it fit within the notion of the cloud? What are its benefits? Could you help us with that first?
Yeah, I think realistically, right? I think this conversation is more important at this time more than I would say, a year ago, right? And the reason I would say that, right, is because of a lot of the pandemic had a huge impact, right? Organizations who had cloud on their roadmap all of a sudden are in the cloud now within a span of 8 months. And I think that's kind of where this topic, to me, even from a business perspective, is even more important, because now that they are in the cloud, like, what is the actual next steps? What are you actually looking to do now that you're already in the cloud, right? And I think that's where a lot of organizations at this stage are looking to analyze their systems, their applications, and see what they can actually do from taking them from on-prem to cloud. And that's kind of where this containerization idea comes in, very fits the model really well, because it allows that portability, right? So in terms of benefits, right, one of the real things that it allows is this portability.
Okay, wait. So I hate to do this, and I'm going to play the guy that's talk to me like I'm a 6-year-old, in the sense that what is it? Like I can hear you, understand what the benefits are, but I don't even know what it is. What is it? What is containerization?
It's clearly Tupperware.
Yeah.
And
now you understand.
and maybe I can start with a real quick high level, and then Albert could really dig in. So if we go back to early distributed computing, basically, if you were an organization, you'd have a need, you'd have an application, you'd build hardware, you'd have a rack, you'd build a server, you'd have the network, and you'd basically provision that asset to accommodate one particular function or one application. And over time, you now have you generally over provision, right? Because if you under provision and the box gets overrun, it stops working. And if you're a Walmart or a Target or a company that's dealing with high online transactions, you've got to be able to process that. If it stops processing, you're out of business. So we had a one-to-one. It was very inefficient. And we evolved to more of a virtualization model where you had an infrastructure, you had an operating system that sat on top of that, then you put a hypervisor on top of that, and then you had an individual kernel with guest OSs, and then you basically have a library in your application. And that was the evolution into virtualization, and it solved a lot of the problems around the one-to-one relationship with hardware.
But and I can just translate that a bit too, because again, there may be folks that aren't even tuning into that what you just said, in the sense that basically the concept of virtualization is, once upon a time we had a whole bunch of servers, and each hardware server had its own purpose. Then we understood that there were ways to take the functions of all those individual servers and collapse them into a single server, so that you didn't need 10, you could have one actual box, but it was serving the function of 10. And that ultimately became the concept of virtualization. Fair, yep. Fair. Okay.
That's fair.
Proceed.
So real quick from there, right? Essentially, with virtualization, right? We have multiple OSs on the same host. It's more efficient than the one-to-one. We have multiple apps on the same host as well. But in today's day and age, it's expensive. By comparison, virtualization's expensive. Multiple kernels, you've got a scenario where it worked at one point ideally, but now we move into the next layer, and the next layer is basically containerization. And what containerization does is it really removes, you have the same host, you have better use of resources, and as Albert started to talk about, it's fast and portable. It's lightweight, and there's no hypervisor. That's the key there. You're not using a hypervisor. You're basically building a container, and in that container, you have some control files, and you have some things and an image, and basically it's all in one. So when Albert talks about, being very portable, you could take that container and move it from location to location, and what that solves is it works on my computer but not on theirs. And that's one of the major issues in development, where if you're a development shop, you get an application, it works perfectly, then you give it off to another team for testing, and all of a sudden it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work because there are other dependencies. Once you incorporate that in a single container, it's much more efficient, and it breaks that challenge of, hey, it works for me but doesn't work for you. Albert, you can fill in, because I know there are lots of details that I just glossed over, but I think at a high level, that's a little bit more of the evolution of the one-to-one to virtualization to containerization in a nutshell.
Right. And so, it's when you think of an application, right, from a development perspective, there are these dependencies, as Todd mentioned, right? You have libraries, you have runtimes, all these things. So depending on which programmatic language you pick, which runtime you pick, what framework you pick, all these things get factored into what are dependencies within the application, right? Now, if you find a way to encapsulate them, right, then I can take that, right, from a developer perspective, and I have, a team of 10 developers, and everybody will be able to work off the same code base, as you will, and have the same dependencies. That has been one of the biggest challenges, because, whenever you onboard a new developer, that developer has to get all the dependencies and have everything on their local machine set up to actually, quote unquote, run the application, build the application, be able to code that application. So you kind of take that away, because you're able to establish this, and I'm going to use the word standard, right, because that's really what it is a standard that allows the application and its dependencies to live within inside this container, has everything that you need. And so from a development perspective, now we've standardized that across the board.
So that makes perfect sense. So, let me say it back. So it's sort of creating a self-contained environment. And, I then, I have controls in place so that application is going to run within that self-contained environment. And I can move that self-contained environment in multiple destinations, and it's still going to run the way I want it to run and expect it to run. Does that sound right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Awesome. So in terms of, can I have multiple applications within one container?
You can. It's not necessarily recommended, right? And the reason why is because a lot of this has to do with architecture, right? When you think of different types of architecture, the main architecture that containers basically are built around is around microservices, right? And then when you look at microservices are just the smallest component, right, that you can use within the architecture. And what you're trying to do at that point is you're trying to isolate, so that if you make a change to this microservice, right, it's not going to impact the entire application, right? So that's one of the things. So you could, but it's not necessarily recommended, right? That's really
and there may not even be an advantage to doing it.
Not really.
There's probably a disadvantage in that, right? You want to be, if you have it to the smallest configuration possible, simplest, when you make changes or when you want to upgrade something, you don't have to rebuild that subsystem. And that's the whole point. If it's modular, you could take that component out and slip in another container that meets that function without necessarily having to rebuild that whole microservice.
That makes sense. And okay, so typically as we have clients come in, start talking to us, they're coming to us with a preset thought process in terms of what the low-hanging fruit is for them with containers. What are we seeing most often? I mean, because I would say that we're in the early days of all of this, and people are looking for the low-hanging fruit. What are they grabbing on right now? in terms of real real applications, real production, from a business perspective?
So I say that basically folds into two basic categories, right? One is you have organizations who have net new projects, a new product that they want to develop. I'm going to use the word product, right? Because it could be an entire system of applications, right? Entire suite, if you will. So you have that. And then you have, on the other hand, you have organizations who want to take what they already have and port it to the cloud, in this case, right? And they see containers as a path to do that, right? But what that really means is that it's going to involve some type of a re-architecture or refactor of that existing product to get that up to the cloud, right? So you have those two categories, right? The reality is, though, both of those categories take you down the same path, right? Whether it's new or if it's something that's being, the path is basically, because you're going to end up architecting it for cloud, right? Architecting it for containers, a container-based architecture, right? So both of those paths take you down the same place. So that part is good, right? And so when you think about it, that's where I'm seeing right now, from an application migration assessment viewpoint, that's where I see most of the customers at this point, at that decision point. Where do we want to go? How do we want to get our application to the cloud? Are we going to invest in refactoring and re-architecting it? Or are we going to just, find a more less expensive way or a cheaper way or a quicker path, an intermediate path before I get to that stage where I refactor, right? Because when you redesign an application, right, it requires, there's, different, what am I going to say here? Different costs. So you can either invest in development, right, or you can just, if you have a vendor that provides that product, maybe it makes more sense to just repurchase it. Or maybe it's really just that simple to basically just re-platform your application. Or maybe it makes more sense right now with the skill set you have to just basically do a lift and shift. So yeah, there is a cost associated with the refactor or re-architecture, right, for an application. And so while the container provides a lot of benefits, right, a lot of it comes back to, are you as an organization able to support that, right? Or do you need a partner? Or do you need, you need to train your developers with a new skill set, right? That's the part I think I really think that gets missed by a lot of organizations, because they too many times we think that technology provides these silver bullets, right? And it doesn't. There's no silver bullet. Yep. There's always going to be that cost and that time investment. It's just a matter, do you really want to go down that path or not?
Albert, let me clarify something you said, because I thought it was pretty interesting. And in my mind, this is how I heard it, but it may not be factual. So let's say a customer has an on-prem architected workload, and it's obviously architected for the data center, and they want to take that workload and put it into Azure. And they look at the cost of re-architecting and doing everything that it would take to move to Azure, and they say there's about $1 million price tag on it. That is too much. We won't see the ROI on that. Could they look at a container scenario and say, I can move it and architect it for the container and move it to Azure and cost me $500,000? Am I thinking about that correctly, or is it much more complex than that?
Well, that's a tough scenario, right? Because you split that cost in half, right? I wish it was really
maybe it's not half. But what is the functionality, or there must be a cost savings to go the container route versus architecting it directly to the cloud, right? Or no?
So before you answer that, Albert, I find it very interesting. Bob, you're the cloud economics guy. I just know you as that because that's one of the areas of expertise that you have. And this is the type of conversation we have almost with every customer, right? They're looking at, what workloads do I move? How much is it going to cost? How do I get it more efficient? And there's no question that containerization and microservices are the future, and that it drives a whole bunch of benefits. but we still have the basic blocking and tackling, right? You look at that application and the question becomes, right, if you want to move that application to Azure, it probably means that that application is critical to your business and is going to live in the future. And I would say that the conversation actually starts even before that, right? What are you going to keep on site, and what can you move to the cloud, and what's the best way to get there? And Albert's other point about, there's no easy button, right? We think we're going to implement technology that's going to make our lives easier. And in some cases, it makes it more efficient, but somebody still has to support it. So if you have a traditional application and you want it containerized and you don't have the ability to really manage that containerization methodology and model, you're now just pushing the challenge to another area, which ultimately goes back to, well, how can a partner help, and what type of services do they offer on an ongoing basis to manage, monitor, and assess the health and well-being of that application? So it's a wider question, and Albert's, and as Albert addresses, how we deal with customers, it's really, looking at the application, looking at the cost factors, and looking at what are you trying to accomplish, right? And yes, you can run containerization on-prem, in the cloud. You can do all kinds of interesting things with those tools. And again, the key to containerization is it's lightweight, it's portable, and it's fast. And those things are aligned ideally with the cloud motion.
Okay, so in that scenario I was speaking of, right? So if it's mobile, right, you put that application in a container, you run into the cloud, and you're not seeing the efficiencies that you think you get. You obviously can pull that right back in, right, and do it, and then you're getting more flexibility by putting it in the container. Is that another fair benefit?
Well, I would say from that standpoint, right, when we talk about portability, right, one of the things it allows you to be is cloud agnostic, right? So yeah, we mentioned Azure, right, and Azure does offer Azure Kubernetes Service, which is basically the container orchestration service for your applications, right? Google provides Google Kubernetes, right, and Amazon has EKS, right, Elastic Kubernetes. But the idea is, with the container-based architecture, right, you should be able to port into any cloud that supports the container orchestration, right? So
interesting. Okay.
You're not tied. If Amazon provides you better cost efficiencies, then maybe it makes sense to be in Amazon. If Microsoft has a better pricing, then maybe it makes more sense there. It all depends, right? And that's what consultants say all the time, right? Is it all depends. A lot of it is dependent on the application itself. One thing I would say is that when you consider an application, right, that you're thinking of, maybe this would be better in a container-based architecture. The issue I think I focus on is on scale, right? What is the scale requirements for this application, right? If this is an internal application that only your 500 employees see, I mean, yeah, you can do it, but does it really make sense? Does it make financial sense to do that? Maybe you use that as a POC to train your people and get them, acclimated to the new technology, right? Maybe you do that, and maybe it makes sense to do that. But if it doesn't, then maybe there's another path for that type of application, right? Or maybe it makes sense to keep it on-prem, right? That's why I said all of it. There's so many factors that it really all depends. But if you could do it in your example for half the cost, right? That might make really good sense, and you might you may end up in whatever cloud that makes sense. It's Google or Amazon or Microsoft or Azure cloud, right? But that's kind of what I think is when organizations think about one thing they don't want is vendor lock, right? They don't want to be tied to a specific vendor, and that's kind of what this portability will give you, is that ability to if I really need to switch, I can switch. And things happen all the time, right? You have changes at the top level, at the C level, that you, as a developer or even a director of software development, you may not have anticipated, right? You get a new CIO, and he comes in and he's like, you know what, we're going to Amazon, and if you were focused on specifically using Azure technologies, right? Because there are some services in Azure that will give you that vendor lock, right? then maybe, it's better to not go down that route, and it's better to be more agnostic in your approach, and that's kind of where the container-based architecture will give you that. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, no, I'm hearing it. I think I'm picking up maybe two, just from a business perspective, benefits. That one is the standards will allow me to have a development and management environment that gives me some, efficiencies, some consistency, stability, efficiencies in terms of how I operate, how my team operates, how we develop, whatever we're developing, whatever that application is. And that's important because the more moving parts, the more, more inefficiencies, the more apt I am to, have to worry about being reactive, right? So that's one thing I'm hearing. And I would think that if I had a ongoing or persistent development environment, this would make sense to me. That would be the first thing I'm hearing. The other thing I'm hearing is this notion of, flexibility, what I would call strategic flexibility. You mentioned the idea that I have an environment that's in a container and it's within Azure, but the CEO comes in and says, I want to move it to AWS. I can do that. It's not a problem. But it would also give me, I would imagine, certain amount of redundancy flexibility. I could take that container and I could have it in multiple environments. And if something happens to Azure, I can be in production with an AWS in a heartbeat, and it's not going to affect things at all. Am I saying the right kind of business cases?
That is 100% correct. And you know what? There are some customers that we've encountered that do want to be in all three clouds, and they want to have that redundancy or even that business continuity DR scenario across multiple clouds, and that this architecture will allow that, right? And that's kind of it's something we don't get often, but it is something we have encountered, right? And they really just they want that DR strategy to cover all entire bases, that to the point where it even covers cloud vendors.
So there's a real core. Oh, I'm sorry, Todd. Go for it.
So really quickly on that note, right? One of the things when we talk about disaster recovery, or we talk, Albert started the discussion talking about scale. One of the key characteristics of containerization is it is very fast startup within seconds, right? There's no hypervisor, there are no separate kernels. So it is very fast and very efficient. So, today, we're constantly having discussions around cost optimization and cloud economics. And we know that if we have resources that are not necessarily always running, right, we can dynamically spin them up and spin them down. But the faster they come up, the more resilient you can build an infrastructure. So we see a lot of customers looking at multi-cloud. We see a lot of customers looking at microservices, because that's the smallest unit of processing around an app that you can have. And you look for efficient ways of getting that to scale up and scale down quickly. And, when we talk about, some of the customer demands that we have today, when we talk about artificial intelligence or machine learning or IoT, right, we are talking about, very, very fast response time, scaling up and being able to meet the demands of the applications. And that's where containerization really shines, because it's so lightweight, it's so self-contained that it's very, very fast by comparison to the traditional hypervisor and virtualization.
Actually, really good segue. We had a hybrid cloud conversation the other day, and some of this came up, and I have two sort of thoughts. I don't think they're necessarily connected. The first is you mentioned Kubernetes, which, obviously that seems to be synonymous with this conversation, and that there are different flavors of it within, the primary clouds. And I want to go there. And then, part of this for me is the notion of running containers on an on-premise or hybrid environment, and what does that look like? But before going to that, my question about Kubernetes, how does that fit in? I mean, what when we talk about Kubernetes and containers, is it a synonymous thing? How do you place the two?
No. So you have containers, right? And so right now at this current point in time, Docker is the the industry standard around the container technology, right? The container engine, if you would, right? So you can build your applications and all the dependencies, encapsulate them in a Docker container, okay? Now, you get that container, realistically, it translates to an image, right? And as an image, when I say image, right, it's the same idea around a virtualized image, right, that you would have within like VMware, right? If you take an image of a VM, right, it's the snapshot of that VM at that point in time. Same thing applies, same concept applies with the containers, right? The container image, snapshot. It has everything that you need to run. Now you need a way to orchestrate it. And when they say orchestration, right, this is what they talk about, the managing of a life cycle of a container. So just like Todd mentioned, right, they load up really quick. And the reason why is because there really is no operating system, right? Everything that you need is inside that container. There's no operating system that's sucking up, all these other resources behind the scenes, right? You contrast that to like something like IIS, right? I need Windows operating system to run IIS. With a container that's a web application inside of it, I don't need that. It's all there inside that container. Lightweight, web server inside. So you need something now to, when you take that container and deploy it, right? I need something that needs to create that container, start that container, if that container somehow throws an exception and, is in an exception state or a dead state, I need something to manage it, to clean it up, right? If I need to stop it, I need something to do that too. So that's what you call container orchestration, right? You want to be able, if I need to scale it out, if I need to create multiple of these containers of the same application, right? I can do that, and I need the orchestration to do that for me. That's what Kubernetes is. Kubernetes is the container orchestration layer.
So really quickly, just for those of us who are fairly new to the topic, there are various orchestrators for containers. So Docker's has Docker Swarm. It's basically shipped with the Docker engine. It's very user friendly and it's easy to get up and running, and it satisfies most things. It's built to be extensible. You have Kubernetes, as Albert just talked about, and I think that came from work that was done with Google and some other open source. And I've always been told to think of it more as a toolkit. It's a little bit more complicated to get up and running, but it's very configurable and very extensible. And then you have Amazon ECS, which is really Amazon's web service container orchestrator. It's provided free, and it provides deep integration into all the AWS resources like auto scaling and IAM and a few other components. But you have various orchestrators, and they all, I wouldn't say that they're all so common that if you knew one, you knew the other. But typically when we talk to customers, there's typically a preference. They've got something that they've piloted or worked in development, and that's typically the direction you take.
Yeah, Todd, absolutely. There's more than just the three that you mentioned, but
yeah, of course.
Realistically, it's interesting how this happens, within the technology community. But you get these competing projects, right, that are trying to become the standard within the industry, right? And I would say at this point in time, right, Kubernetes is the standard, right? A lot of the cloud vendors have gotten behind it, as opposed to Swarm doesn't have as much pull behind it anymore. I mean, there's some organizations that do use it, but realistically, Kubernetes has gained so much traction that I think at this point in time, there really is very little competition in that area.
And I'm kind of picking up it's an open platform type solution, right? Okay. Whereas Docker would be, it's a proprietary product.
It's still open. I mean, you can still use it. I mean, I know there's some licensing things when you use it at the enterprise level, but in terms of the services that are provided by the cloud vendors, right? I have not seen Azure come out with a Docker Swarm service, right? But they have come out with Kubernetes, right? So there's been that partnership around those projects within Amazon, Google, and obviously it was a Google project to begin with, but Azure and AWS both are on board with that as well. So that's what I'm saying. Industry-wise, between the three largest cloud vendors, there is that orchestration service there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's so true about our space that, there's always this new development. Then there's this, swarm is a good word, swarm of attention by all the, various the commercial elements, and people develop their flavors of it, and then ultimately there's one version or one winner that becomes critical mass, and that's happened countless times in our world, and obviously we're seeing that play out here. But going back to the hybrid on-premise thing, does this translate to that world, or is that not necessarily in play?
There has been some organizations that have basically, in terms of the hybrid space, what they've done is they've deployed locally within their data centers their own Kubernetes services, and so which allows them to basically use some of their infrastructure specifically for containers, right? And then when they're ready, they just, if they want, because some of these applications may not be, their security teams may not allow them to go to cloud either, right? Because these are public cloud, right? And while you can still make, isolate these things and make them private, sometimes they're just not allowed for compliance reasons, right? So they just basically set up these, Kubernetes clusters inside their environment, and then from there they're able to, still use container-based architecture within that, But of course, they have limited resources, right, with that infrastructure. So sometimes it makes more sense that they want to scale that out, better to scale out in cloud if they're allowed to, if they're able to, as opposed to trying to scale out their internal data center infrastructure. Right.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. Okay, good.
So I have a question before we jump to the next one. It may be silly, but I'm trying to think of what's next, and maybe this is out there already. But do you see a world where organizations will be building applications in containers and then basically take it to some type of public cloud marketplace where AWS, Azure, Oracle, IBM, et cetera, will say, we'll try to bid on type of winning that business or winning that container business with a company? You see what I'm saying? Like a business driver of driving that container, building it out, and then making a competitive environment so the public cloud competes for that business.
So I'd say yes. There's definitely a market, and there's a growing concept around having applications that are potentially packaged in a container, in an open source way where you can incorporate that in your particular container engine. As far as whether or not that's in the marketplace now, Albert, maybe you can comment on that.
I don't really see that actual scenario yet. I do think that maybe that would be future state in terms of the actual competition. Right now, what you're seeing right now is a lot of developers,
early development
community, basically, because the development community likes a lot of open source, right? So you're getting, even from Microsoft and others, right? They have made a lot of the latest technology open source, right? And that's how some of these projects actually get a lot of good tractions, because a lot of good developers from all over the world basically contribute to those projects. But I have seen within like the gaming community, there's a lot of people putting together their own containers to run certain games, right? And I'm not a gamer, but I mean, I know this, that they are, because they're able to add some certain aspects to these projects, these gaming projects, and able to come together. Now, whether those are marketable or sellable, that's to be determined, right? But people are always trying to improve their own. They're always trying to find a way to hack their own way of making something the way they want it to be, right? And so even with limited development, because of the containers, right, people who have limited development but who love games are still able to get into that community as well. And so but I haven't seen anything, but I do think maybe future state it might get to.
Yeah, I was thinking that could be a future state.
Yep.
What about, I'm sorry, just thinking outside the box here, but what if you're a traditional on-prem software provider and you started providing your application or your solutions in one of these containers, and you basically deliver it to the client and say, listen, this will run in your data center, or it can run in Azure, it can run in AWS, run in private cloud, whatever you want to do. Mr. and Mrs. Customer, this fits this model. Have you seen traditional software companies look at something like that and delivering their traditional software in a container so it has that flexibility of mobility?
Not like delivered, like the product would not be delivered in the container. What I've seen more is that they just basically use that technology to either come up with their own platform that they can service, or basically a software as a service model where they tried behind the scenes. It's their, they're not going to release, because if they give if they provide the software in the container, right, you can see the insides of that container, right? It's not something that is completely secure to the point where like you want to keep that IP. You don't want that IP to go out. So
I got you.
Necessarily wouldn't be delivering. I wouldn't be delivering to my customer if I was a software shop. I would not be delivering. I would deliver it in a container, but I wouldn't be giving them, if I was selling it to them, the container itself.
Yeah. You would mask it, and I think Albert just had a good point, right? A lot of the software as a service vendors that kind of offer a package with immediate functionality. The days of building another custom thing or spinning up another virtual instance, and again, remember what I talked about. Virtualization is expensive by comparison to containerization. So again, if you're in business and you're driving software and you're providing cloud-based software or software as a service, if you're able to, leverage containerization, you've got those key things. Again, it's very fast, it's very portable, and it's very efficient, and it's considerably less money than virtualization. So absolutely, that plays into some of the software development life cycle and the ability to scale. And again, Albert talked about, scale is one of the key things for containerization. If you're a small company and you're not planning on growing much and you don't have a lot of change, containerization, you have to really look at what's the value, how much does it cost to get there, and how does that value live over the lifetime of that software usage. But once you talk about commercial software and software as a service and cloud, it makes a much stronger, compelling argument to containerize.
Yeah, that's really cool, guys.
Yeah, no, great conversation. I know we're coming up on time, so I guess Albert, let me ask you. I heard you talk, and this is not about containers. So early in your career, you said you were in the Hollywood space. You're living in Southern California. Have you ever worked on a project with big time celebrity you want to talk about?
Oh no, I mean I was in the nonprofit space, so I mean it was
come
not.
On.
I mean,
I wanted a good story.
I would say I did attend a wedding with I want to say it was many years back. Donnie Wahlberg.
Oh, cool.
And then I did bump into Lou Diamond Phillips at one of the hotels where the wedding was at. That guy was a really cool guy.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's always good when you hear that they're nice. I just, we have all these expectations, which are completely unfounded, but it's great when, you have a real life experience and they turn out to be, just good people, which is great to hear.
Yeah. So
that's cool. No, I mean, very Hollywood-esque. But you know what, in terms of the container conversation, fascinating. Thank you so much, Albert, for joining us. And Todd, thanks again for helping us guide this conversation and jumping in. It's really, really very, very, very interesting. Bob, any parting thoughts, words?
No, it's just great. Great. Thanks for the time, guys. Now I know what to do with my Tupperware, so I'm all good. Thanks so much.
All right, guys, have a good one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.